On a night of a devastating storm, a 6-year-old girl runs desperately through the flooded streets, fleeing from men chasing her. When she finds refuge in a luxurious gated community, she sees a luxury SUV approaching and makes a decision that will change 2 lives forever. Soaked clothes, shivering with cold and fear, she approaches the millionaire stepping out of the car and whispers a heartbreaking question. "Uncle, can I sleep under your car? There it doesn't rain on me, and I won't bother anyone." The shock in his eyes transforms into something far deeper when he realizes a child would rather sleep on cold asphalt than trespass on the property. What happens next leaves her in shock. The wind howled like a wounded creature through the glass and steel canyons of the city, tearing through the night with a frigid lament. The rain didn't fall. It threw itself from the dark sky in thick, furious sheets, turning the sophisticated streets into turbulent rivers that swept leaves and trash along in their current. For little Leah, only 6 years old, the sound of the storm was the sound of the world ending. Her bare feet splashed in puddles of icy water, and the thin dress she wore, already threadbare and faded, clung to her tiny body like a cold, sodden second skin. The frantic little heart hammering in her chest wasn't just from the cold or nature's fury, but from the much more palpable fear of the 2 men whose angry shouts still echoed in her mind. She had dared to snatch a hardened piece of bread from the trash behind a fancy restaurant, an unforgivable crime in the eyes of those who saw her as nothing more than a nuisance. Her diminutive body, fueled by desperate adrenaline, found an unlikely salvation. A narrow gap in the wrought iron fence that surrounded a luxury gated community. She squeezed through the opening, scratching her arms and tearing the fabric of her dress even more, but the pain barely registered. On the other side, the world changed. The chaos of the street gave way to an eerie calm. The grass was an emerald carpet, trimmed with mathematical precision. The flowers, heavy with rain, bowed in silent reverence. It was a perfect garden, a sanctuary that seemed to belong to another planet. Leah dove behind a bush of gardenias, the sweet scent of the flowers mingling with the smell of wet earth. There, huddled and shivering, she allowed herself to breathe. The chattering of her teeth was the only thing that broke the garden's silence. Besides the incessant drumming of the rain, from her hiding spot, she watched the polished stone driveway that led to the mansions. Each house was a palace, with enormous windows that spilled warm, golden light into the dark night. They were beacons of comfort and safety, entire worlds from which she was irremediably excluded. It was then that a pair of powerful headlights cut through the curtain of rain, approaching slowly. A silver Escalade, so large and shiny it looked like a spaceship, glided down the driveway and stopped just a few yards from where she was hiding. The quiet engine whispered before it died, and for a moment, all was silent again. The driver's door opened, and a tall man stepped out, shielded by an immense black umbrella. He wore a dark suit that seemed to repel the water and shoes that shone even in the dim light. Arthur Caldwell felt the exhaustion of a week of tough negotiations, of meetings that decided the fate of millions in capital and investments. His mind, always calculating, was already on his stock portfolio, on the quarterly earnings report he needed to analyze. He just wanted the silence of his home, the warmth of his fireplace, and a glass of his favorite single malt scotch. As he locked the car with his remote, a faint, almost imperceptible sound caught his attention. He turned, his eyes scanning the impeccable garden. He saw nothing but plants bending under the weight of the storm. He was about to turn and head for his door when a tiny, trembling figure emerged from the shadow of the gardenias. Leah took one step forward, then another. Each movement was a battle between panic and necessity. The man stared at her, his face a mask of surprise and suspicion. She stopped at a safe distance, her small hands clasped in front of her, her head bowed. The rain beat down on her dark hair and ran down her pale face. She lifted her eyes, large and brown, filled with a seriousness that no 6-year-old should ever know. Her voice came out as a whisper, as fragile as the flutter of a sparrow's wings, but it carried the weight of a desperate plea that cut through the storm and hit Arthur squarely. "Mister," she said, her voice trembling, "can I sleep under your car? The rain doesn't get in there, and I promise I won't be any trouble." The question hung in the heavy, humid air, a request so absurd and so poignant that, for an instant, Arthur's brain refused to process it. He, a man whose life was a fortress built on logic, numbers, and the methodical accumulation of a vast fortune, was completely disarmed. His routine was a ritual of precision: wake up, analyze the financial markets, multiply his capital, return home. There was no room for the unexpected, for the illogical, for the raw misery that now materialized in his perfectly manicured garden. His first reaction was an impulse of irritation. How had this child gotten in? He paid a fortune for security precisely to keep the outside world, with all its disorder, beyond his gates. He should call security, handle the problem with the same impersonal efficiency with which he managed his business and his assets. It was standard procedure. But then he looked at her. Really looked. Not at the dirt or the torn clothes, but at her eyes. They were eyes that held a galaxy of old sorrows. Yet at that moment, they shone with a spark of integrity that shocked him. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't trying to invade his house. She didn't ask for food. There was an invisible line she had drawn herself, a boundary of dignity that kept her from asking to come inside, but allowed her to ask for the ground beneath an object. She preferred the impersonal shelter of a machine to begging for human compassion inside a home. That realization hit him with the force of a gut punch. In his world of contracts and clauses, of negotiations where each party tried to gain an advantage, this small creature displayed a code of honor he rarely encountered. "Come on," he said, his voice hoarser than he intended. He took a step back and opened the front door wider, a portal of warm, golden light spilling out into the rainy darkness. Leah didn't move. Her eyes widened, shifting from him to the vastness of the entryway. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, paralyzed between the instinct to flee and the promise of safety. Arthur sighed, a weary sound. He closed the umbrella, letting the rain soak him too, a small gesture to shrink the distance between them. "It's okay. You'll catch a cold out there. Come on, get inside." He held out his hand, not to touch her, but as an invitation. Hesitantly, with tiny steps, she moved toward the light. When her bare, mud-caked feet touched the polished white marble of the foyer, she froze instantly. Her eyes shot down to the dark smudges she was leaving on the immaculate floor. Panic seized her face. She looked at the floor, then at his expensive shoes, and a dry sob escaped her lips. She was desecrating this place. She was dirtying something expensive, something that didn't belong to her, and the guilt seemed to crush her. Arthur saw the terror in her eyes, and his heart, a muscle he rarely exercised outside of family obligations, contracted. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling to get on her level, ignoring the water seeping from his expensive suit onto the floor. "Don't worry about the floor. It's just water and dirt. We can clean it later. The important thing is for you to get warm." He guided her inside, closing the door and sealing out the sound of the storm. The silence of the house was almost as overwhelming as the noise of the rain. He watched her for a moment, such a small, fragile figure in the midst of his vast, empty wealth. He offered her a soft towel, dry clothes from a distant relative she'd never known, and a steaming mug of hot chocolate. She accepted everything with a reverent silence, as if each gesture were a gift too precious to handle. After some time, when color began to return to her face, Arthur led her toward an imposing staircase. "I have plenty of guest rooms. You can pick any one you like. The beds are very comfortable." Leah stopped at the bottom step, the empty mug held with both hands against her chest. She shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on his, the same seriousness from before returning with full force. "Thank you, mister, but I don't want a bed." Arthur frowned, confused. "I want to sleep there," she whispered, pointing with her chin toward the door that led to the garage. "Near the car. It's safer." Her declaration, so simple and firm, left Arthur speechless. "Safer," he repeated, disbelief coloring his tone. "Safer than a room with a locked door and a warm bed." He looked around at the high walls of his mansion, the discreetly hung artwork, the staircase that swept upward in an elegant curve. His entire home was designed to be an impenetrable fortress, a refuge from the chaotic world. His net worth wasn't just measured in money, but in the security and control it afforded him. The idea that the concrete floor of his garage could offer more security than the heart of his home was a paradox his logical mind couldn't decipher. He knelt again, trying to meet her eyes, which were now studying the pattern of the marble floor. "Leah, listen, there's an engine in there. Oil. It's not a place for a child to sleep. I promise you, you will be perfectly safe in a room." She shook her head again, a small but definitive movement. "The car is good," she whispered, her voice muffled. "He's big and strong. He didn't see me in the rain. He just let me be close. Houses have owners, and owners can change their minds." Her childlike logic was brutally simple, and for him, devastating. She didn't trust people or promises, but she trusted the indifference of an inanimate object. The silver Escalade hadn't judged her, hadn't chased her away. In her mind, it was a silent guardian. The house, on the other hand, belonged to him, and he, like every other adult in her life, could change his mind at any moment and send her back out into the storm. Realizing this felt like being punched in the gut. He, who controlled corporate boards and made billionaires tremble with a word, couldn't convince a 6-year-old girl that he was trustworthy. A profound exhaustion washed over him. He thought of Elvira, his housekeeper, who would arrive in the morning and find this situation. What would she say? What would his own mother? A woman who valued appearances above all else? Think of a street child sleeping in his house. But then he looked at Leah's pale, determined face, and all the other voices in his head fell silent. The only thing that mattered was the fear in those eyes. He could force her, carry her up to the most luxurious guest room, but he would only be trading one kind of safety for another kind of terror. He would be breaking the only thing she seemed to have, a fragile sense of control over her own fate. "All right," he said, finally surrendering. "All right, if the garage is where you feel safe, then the garage is where you'll sleep." The relief that flooded her face was so intense it nearly brought him to tears. He stood up and, in silence, went to the linen closet. He ignored the regular sheets and grabbed the thickest goose-down comforter, pillows that felt like clouds, and a cashmere blanket that was worth more than most people's cars. He went down the stairs and into the cool, immaculate garage. Next to the Escalade's front tire, he arranged the items, creating a soft, warm nest on the concrete floor. He plugged in a small reading lamp and placed it beside the makeshift bed, creating a welcoming circle of light. Leah followed him, watching his every move with wide eyes. When he was finished, she approached slowly and touched the comforter with her fingertips, as if testing its reality. He helped her lie down and tucked her in. She curled up, sinking into the softness, and for the first time that night, a small smile touched her lips. "Thank you, mister," she murmured, her eyes already closing with exhaustion. He stood there for a long time, a multi-millionaire in a luxury garage, watching over a sleeping child who found safety next to a metal wheel. It was the most surreal scene of his life. Finally, he went back inside, leaving the door from the kitchen ajar so he could hear her. The morning arrived, grey and damp. Arthur had barely slept, his mind racing. He went downstairs and found Elvira in the kitchen, already in her pristine uniform. She was an efficient, discreet, middle-aged woman who had worked for his family for years. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said, but her tone was strained. "Forgive my forwardness, sir, but what is that in the garage?" She pointed to the ajar door, her face a mask of shock and disapproval. "There's a child sleeping on the floor, for heaven's sake." "She looks like an abandoned little animal." Arthur felt a spike of annoyance at Elvira's comparison, but suppressed it. She didn't know anything. To her, this was just a shocking anomaly in a house where everything had always been predictable and orderly. "Her name is Leah, Elvira, and she's there because that's where she felt safe enough to sleep," he replied, his voice firm as he poured a cup of coffee. The housekeeper's expression shifted from disapproval to pure bewilderment. She had known Arthur since he was a young man focused on building his empire, a man who rarely let emotion interfere with his decisions. His life was a well-calculated equation of risk and reward, focused on increasing his net worth, not sheltering street children. "But, sir, how did she get in here? The security? And what do you intend to do?" "You can't just keep a child in the garage." "I know that, Elvira, and I will handle the situation," he said, more to himself than to her. "For now, just be kind to her. Make a nice breakfast, something a 6-year-old would like." He walked away, leaving the housekeeper in her immaculate kitchen, muttering about the strangeness of the world and the foolishness of the rich. He went to the garage. The soft morning light filtered through the high window, illuminating the nest of blankets. Leah was still sleeping soundly, her face serene, one small hand splayed against the Escalade's cold tire, as if seeking comfort from the contact. Seeing her like that, so peaceful after the terror of the previous night, solidified something within him, a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but which now felt inescapable. In the days that followed, a strange routine established itself in the mansion. Leah continued to insist on sleeping in the garage, and Arthur, against all his instincts for logic and comfort, allowed it. During the day, however, she began to explore the house with the cautious curiosity of a kitten. She didn't touch anything, just looked, her big eyes absorbing the scale and silence of the place. He bought her new clothes, coloring books, and a few toys, which she accepted with a quiet, overwhelming gratitude. Elvira, after her initial shock, began to soften. Soon she was making special snacks and leaving little treats for Leah to find. Slowly, the silence of the house began to be filled with new sounds. Leah's soft laugh at a cartoon, the scratch of crayons on paper, the sound of Elvira telling her a story. Arthur found himself adjusting his own schedules. He cancelled late afternoon meetings, turned down business dinners. He discovered a strange satisfaction in simply being home. Listening to the quiet sounds of Leah's presence, he realized just how empty his life had been, filled only with the pursuit of more money, more profit, more assets. Leah was an element that didn't fit on any spreadsheet, an investment of a purely emotional nature. However, he knew this bubble of tranquility couldn't last. Someone would notice, a curious neighbor, a delivery driver, and that's exactly what happened. On the 5th day, the doorbell rang. It was a severe-looking woman, with a tight bun and a grey suit that seemed as rigid as her posture. She introduced herself as Helen, a social worker from Child Protective Services. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her eyes sweeping the foyer with a critical gaze, "we received an anonymous tip. It alleged that a small child is living here, with you, a single man. You understand that this is highly irregular." The word irregular hung in the air, laden with suspicion and insinuation. The outside world, which he had tried to keep at bay, was now knocking at his door. Arthur felt his blood run cold. He had anticipated this, but the reality of the confrontation was much harsher. He glanced over the woman's shoulder and saw Leah peeking out from the living room, her face pale with fear. She had heard every word. The threat was no longer a storm outside, but a woman in a grey suit, who had the power to take her away. "She is safe here," Arthur said, his voice low and controlled, but Helen didn't look convinced. Her eyes narrowed, assessing him, and he knew that the hardest negotiation of his life was just beginning. "Safety is a relative term, Mr. Caldwell," Helen retorted, her voice smooth as ice, as her eyes took a quick inventory of the room. She noted the opulence, of course, but her professional gaze was looking for something more. It sought signs of disorder, of danger, of something out of place. And ironically, the presence of a child in this sterile environment was the greatest anomaly of all. A single man, with no parenting experience, harboring a street child without following any legal protocol. As well-intentioned as you may be, the situation is untenable and potentially dangerous for the girl. Her words were procedural, but the implicit accusation was clear. He was a suspect, his house a scene to be investigated. Arthur felt a wave of impotent fury. He, who bought and sold companies, who influenced the flow of global capital, was being judged by a bureaucrat in his own home. "Please, come in," he said, stepping back and forcing a tone of politeness he didn't feel. "We can talk in the living room." He gestured to Leah, who was still frozen in the doorway, and tried to offer her a reassuring smile. She didn't return it. Her eyes were fixed on Helen, the expression of someone who recognizes an old enemy. The system, with its forms and impersonal rules, had hurt her before. Helen entered, her briefcase held under her arm like a weapon. She sat on the edge of a white leather sofa, declining the offer of coffee. Her mission was clear: assess, document, and remove. "I need to speak with the child." "Alone," she declared. Arthur hesitated. "She's frightened. She doesn't talk much to strangers." "I'm trained to deal with frightened children, Mr. Caldwell. It's my job." Her insistence left no room for negotiation. With a heavy heart, Arthur called Leah over. "Leah, this is Helen. She just wants to talk with you for a little bit, okay?" Leah approached slowly, her bare feet making an almost inaudible sound on the Persian rug. She wouldn't look at Helen, keeping her eyes downcast. Arthur retreated to his study, leaving the door ajar, anxiety gnawing at him. He could hear the murmurs of their conversation, Helen's voice, professionally gentle, asking questions, and Leah's silence, a response more powerful than any word. He imagined what was going through her small head. Was she reliving past traumas? Was she afraid he would hand her over? The interview didn't last long. Helen emerged from the room with the same severe expression. "She's uncooperative. She refuses to say where she came from or who her parents are. That complicates things." "She just needs time," Arthur argued. "She's been through something terrible." "Time is a luxury the system doesn't often provide," Helen said, standing up. "I will file my report. For now, she will remain here under your temporary care, but I will be making daily, unannounced visits. And, Mr. Caldwell, I advise you to find a lawyer. You're going to need one." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. He was no longer a good Samaritan. He was part of a legal process, a man under investigation. In the days that followed, the tension in the house became almost palpable. Helen would appear at random times with her notepad and her inquisitive stare. Leah would retreat even further into herself during these visits, becoming a small statue of silence. Arthur, meanwhile, dove into the world he knew best: strategy. He hired the best law firm in the city, instructing them to begin the process of obtaining legal guardianship of Leah. It was a bold, almost impulsive move, but he felt he had no choice. Returning Leah to the system that terrified her so much felt like a betrayal. While the legal battle began behind the scenes, a new, grittier and more immediate danger began to creep into his sanctuary. One morning, as he was leaving for work, Arthur found the side of his precious silver Escalade keyed from end to end. A single word had been gouged into the gleaming metal with a sharp object: thief. Arthur's blood boiled. He knew immediately who was responsible. The men from the restaurant, the ones Leah had fled from on the night of the storm. Somehow they had tracked her down. They had discovered her refuge. And now they were sending a message. They weren't just vandalizing a luxury car. They were desecrating the one symbol of safety Leah knew. They were attacking the shelter she herself had chosen, turning her safe harbor into a target. The sight of that word, scratched into the car's flawless paint, felt like a personal insult. Not because of the monetary damage. That was insignificant, a tiny fraction of his daily dividends. It was the violation, the audacity of the act that enraged him. They had trespassed onto his property, a space he considered inviolable, to leave a mark of hate. And the target wasn't him, the multimillionaire, but the fragile child he had taken in. Arthur immediately called the community security, who promised to review the cameras and increase patrols, but he knew it wasn't enough. These men weren't common criminals. They were driven by a petty, persistent malice. They were the kind of predators who delight in tormenting the weak. He decided not to tell Leah about the vandalism. He asked Elvira to keep her busy in the back of the house and called a specialized service to repair the damage immediately. As he watched the technicians work, a cold sense of vulnerability hit him. For the first time in many years, he felt that his money and influence might not be enough to protect someone he cared about. The threat wasn't a hostile takeover bid or a stock market crash. It was something primal, visceral, and he felt dangerously unprepared. The problems, however, seemed to multiply like cancer cells. A few days later, while his lawyer was updating him on the infuriatingly slow progress of the guardianship case, the doorbell rang again. At the door were a slovenly man and woman with shrewd eyes. The man was thin, with yellowed teeth and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The woman was heavy-set, her bleached hair and heavy makeup failing to hide the lines of a hard life. "We're the foster parents of Melissa," the man said, using a name Arthur had never heard. "We heard she's here. We've come to get her." Arthur felt the floor drop out from under him. Foster parents. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the couple. There wasn't a shred of genuine concern on their faces, only a poorly disguised greed. "Her name is Leah," he corrected, his voice icy, "and she's not going anywhere with you." The man's smile widened. "Oh, but she is. We've got the papers. We're her legal guardians. But, you know, she's a difficult girl, a lot of trouble. Maybe we could come to an arrangement. A rich man like you. Perhaps you could help us with some compensation for the trouble she's caused us, and to, let's say, persuade us to leave her in peace." The extortion was so blatant Arthur almost laughed. They didn't want the girl. They wanted his money. They were vultures, sniffing out an opportunity to profit from the situation. This was the first significant obstacle, a human and corrupt barrier in Leah's path to safety. "Get off my property, now," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous, "or I'm calling the police." The woman laughed, an unpleasant sound. "Call them. We'll show them the documents. You're the one who's going to have to explain yourself, hiding someone else's kid. Think about it, Mr. Caldwell. A small contribution to our financial stability, and we disappear forever." They turned and walked away, leaving their threat hanging in the air, as toxic as a cloud of poison. The situation was spiraling out of control. He was now facing a suspicious social worker, anonymous vandals, and now supposed foster parents who were blackmailers. The complexity of the problem was growing exponentially. He went into the living room where Leah was drawing. She looked up, sensing his tension. "Who was that, mister?" "No one important, sweetheart, just some lost people." But as he spoke, he knew it was a lie. They were dangerous people, and the worst was yet to come. His lawyer called late that afternoon, his voice grave. "Arthur, I have bad news. The situation is more complicated than we thought." The social worker ran a deeper check. Leah, or Melissa, as she's listed in the records, She's a runaway from an orphanage, and they are actively looking for her. They want her back. The revelation fell on Arthur like a slab of concrete. An orphanage. The word sounded cold and institutional, a place of files, rules, and anonymity. Suddenly, Leah's refusal to talk about her past, her fear of authority, figures like Helen, her visceral need to feel safe near an object instead of a person, it all started to fit together into a dark, painful puzzle. She wasn't just running from angry men or a negligent foster family. She was running from an entire system that had somehow terrified her. The threat was no longer just a pair of vandals or blackmailers. It was an institution with the legal power to pluck her out of his life and drag her back to the place from which she had escaped. "Do they have the legal right to take her?" Arthur asked his lawyer, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Unfortunately, yes," the lawyer replied, "unless we can prove conclusively that the environment at the orphanage is harmful to her, they have custody. And proving that, Arthur, is a mammoth court battle. They have records, social workers, psychologists, and we have the testimony of a 6-year-old child who barely speaks." Arthur hung up, feeling cornered. All his usual tools, his wealth, his connections, his power to negotiate, seemed useless against the insurmountable wall of bureaucracy and law. He was playing a game whose rules he didn't understand, and the stake was Leah's life. He went to find her. He found her in the backyard, sitting on the grass, talking quietly to a ladybug that was crawling on her finger. The innocence of the scene contrasted so starkly with the sinister complexity of her situation that Arthur's heart ached. He sat down next to her, silent for a long time, just watching the little red bug. "Leah," he began, his voice careful, "did you ever live in a place with a lot of other children? A big place, with no mommy or daddy?" She froze. The ladybug flew off her finger, but she didn't seem to notice. Her shoulders tensed and she hugged her knees, shrinking into herself. She said nothing, but her silence was a deafening answer. It was a yes, screamed from the bottom of a well of fear. That night, the storm raging in Arthur's world intensified. He barely slept, his mind racing through scenarios, strategies, legal loopholes. He couldn't lose her. The thought of handing Leah back to a place that haunted her was unthinkable. She had become more than a charity project. She was an unexpected light in his empty life. The next morning, Helen arrived for one of her unannounced visits. This time, however, something in her posture was different. There was less rigidity, less suspicion. She watched Arthur, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the genuine worry etched on his face. "I found out about the orphanage," she said, her voice softer than usual, "and about the supposed foster parents. They have a history of similar scams. The department is already investigating them." A small spark of hope ignited in Arthur, but Helen quickly extinguished it. "But that doesn't change the fact that the Northwood Children's Home has custody of her. They've been notified and are sending a representative to pick her up. Tomorrow." "Tomorrow." The word came out as a choke. "You can't let them. You've seen what she's like. She's terrified of strangers, of all of this." "My hands are tied, Mr. Caldwell. I follow orders." But then she did something unexpected. She glanced at Leah, who was in the adjacent room, visible through an archway, and her professional eyes filled with a conflicted, almost tender emotion. She looked back at Arthur, and for an instant, the social worker vanished, and only the woman, Helen, remained. "However," she said, lowering her voice, "there's something you should know. The director of the home, a Mrs. Albright, is notoriously difficult. She doesn't care about the children's well-being, only about the institution's reputation and funding. If there were any irregularities, she'd be the one to cover them up." The information was a thread of hope, a subtle clue left for him to follow. But the real turning point, the event that would change the course of everything, happened later that night. Leah, who had been strangely quiet all day, started to feel sick. First, it was a low-grade fever. Then, a coughing fit that left her breathless. Arthur, in a panic, called his private doctor for an emergency house call. The doctor, a calm, grey-haired man, examined the little girl carefully. After a series of tests and questions, he turned to Arthur with a grave expression. "This isn't a simple cold," he said. "Her lungs are congested, and I've noticed a pallor and fatigue that aren't normal. We need to get her to the hospital for more thorough tests. Immediately. I suspect a serious medical condition, something that's been neglected for a very, very long time." The doctor's preliminary diagnosis echoed through the silent room, turning the atmosphere from concern to outright panic. "Neglected?" Arthur repeated, the word searing itself into his mind. "What does that mean? How serious is it?" The doctor, Dr. Evans, looked at Leah, who was curled up on the sofa, her breathing short and shallow. "I don't want to speculate before the tests, Arthur, but the symptoms are consistent with a congenital heart condition that, if left untreated, can have severe consequences. The fact that she's reached this age without a proper diagnosis is, frankly, a case of gross negligence." The word negligence hit Arthur with the force of a revelation. It wasn't just emotional cruelty or a lack of affection that Leah had suffered at the orphanage. It was a disregard for her very life. The institution that was supposed to protect her had ignored the signs of a disease that could have been silently consuming her. Without a second thought, Arthur swept Leah into his arms. She was feverish and frighteningly light. "We're going to the hospital, the best one there is," he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. As he sped through the city streets, the silver Escalade, once a symbol of status, had now become a makeshift ambulance. Leah was lying on the back seat, wrapped in a blanket, and Elvira, who had insisted on coming, held her small hand, whispering words of comfort. At the hospital, Arthur's influence and wealth opened doors. A team of the best specialists was assembled in record time. The next few hours were a blur of scans, beeping machines, and tense conversations with doctors in sterile white hallways. Finally, the confirmation came. Leah had a rare heart defect that required a delicate, expensive surgery and months of follow-up care. The cost to Arthur was irrelevant. He would spend every penny of his fortune, sell all his stocks, liquidate every investment fund to save her. The real obstacle was something else. "Since you are not her legal guardian," the hospital administrator explained, a man in a suit with an impassive face, "we cannot perform the procedure without authorization from the Northwood Children's Home." The irony was cruel. The very people who had neglected Leah's health for years now held the power to authorize the treatment that would save her life, and they were coming to take her back the next day. Arthur felt a cold, calculating rage take hold of him. It was time to stop reacting and start attacking. He called his lawyer in the middle of the night. "I want you to file for an emergency injunction. Now, use the medical diagnosis. Accuse the orphanage of negligence. Do whatever it takes. But I need authorization for this surgery by dawn." Next, he made another call. To his mother, Matilda Caldwell, the family matriarch. It was a call he had been dreading. He explained the situation, his voice filled with an urgency she had never heard before. Her response was exactly what he had feared. "Arthur, for God's sake, I told you getting involved with these people would only bring trouble. A sick child, a scandal with an orphanage. This will tarnish our family name. If you continue with this foolishness, this hero complex, your father and I will have to reevaluate your access to the family trust fund. Think about your future, the business, the legacy we've built." The threat was clear. Choose between the girl and his family fortune. Between Leah and the empire he had helped build. To Matilda, Leah wasn't a child in need, but a liability, a high-risk investment with zero return. "It's not a complex, Mother. It's a child's life," he replied, his voice sharp. "And if I have to choose, the choice is already made." He hung up, feeling the weight of the bridge he had just burned. He was on his own, alone against an orphanage, against the legal system, and now against his own family. He looked through the glass of the pediatric ICU. Leah was in a small bed, surrounded by monitors. Helen, the social worker, was standing beside her. She had shown up at the hospital as soon as she heard, her expression no longer that of a public servant, but of a genuinely concerned woman. Her eyes met Arthur's through the glass, and in them he saw an unexpected ally. But even with a new ally, the night was long, and the most dangerous enemy had yet to show its true face. The night at the hospital dragged on, each tick of the clock on the hallway wall a hammer blow to his nerves. Arthur and Helen kept a silent vigil outside the ICU, separated by the glass that distanced them from Leah, but united by a shared concern that dissolved the professional barriers between them. "They can't just let her die," Helen whispered, more to herself than to him, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. "Even Mrs. Albright wouldn't be that cruel." "Cruelty isn't her problem. Reputation is," Arthur answered, his mind working furiously. "Aubrey, if she authorizes the surgery here, she's admitting the home's negligence. She'll try to take her, promise treatment at a public hospital to control the narrative. We can't let that happen." The unlikely alliance between the multimillionaire and the social worker solidified in that sterile corridor. Helen, with her insider's knowledge of the system, and Arthur, with his nearly limitless resources, began to form a plan. She gave him names, contacts, told him about procedures and loopholes that only someone on the inside would know. He, in turn, set his legal team to work, exploiting every one of those loopholes with the aggression of a shark. By dawn, Arthur's lawyer had secured a temporary injunction, delaying Leah's removal by the orphanage for 48 hours, citing her critical medical condition. It was a small victory, a breath of air bought at a steep price in legal fees, but it gave them precious time. However, as they fought on one front, the enemy attacked on another. Arthur received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was rough, distorted, but unmistakably malicious. It was one of the men who had vandalized his car. "So your precious little package is in the hospital, huh?" The voice sneered. "Looks like she's gotten pretty valuable to you. So valuable, maybe you'd be willing to pay to make sure she stays okay. Let's say a large sum of dollars, or maybe Bitcoin, to be more discreet." Arthur's blood ran cold. They were no longer interested in petty revenge. They had realized how much Leah meant to him and saw her as an asset to be exploited. The girl he was trying to save from a disease was now the target of a much more direct and dangerous extortion plot. Before Arthur could respond, the line went dead. He looked at his phone, the device suddenly feeling like a sinister object in his hand. He was being attacked from all sides. His family was pressuring him financially, the legal system was questioning his motives, and now street-level criminals saw him as an easy mark. The pressure was immense. He felt as if he were trying to keep a sandcastle standing, while waves crashed in from every direction. Helen saw the change in his expression. "What is it?" "Trouble," he said, his voice tense. "The men who were chasing her, they know where we are. And now they want money." The news made Helen's face go white. The situation had just escalated from a complicated legal battle to a life-threatening security crisis. As they were discussing what to do, hire private security, involve the police, the unthinkable happened. Elvira, who had gone to the hospital cafeteria to get Helen some tea, came running back, her face twisted in panic, the words tumbling out of her. "She's gone. Leah, she's not in her room." The nurse said a man and a woman introduced themselves as relatives, said they were transferring her to another hospital at the orphanage's request. And they took her. Arthur felt the air being ripped from his lungs. He sprinted to the ICU. The small bed was empty, the sheets in disarray. The heart monitor emitted a flat, high-pitched tone, signaling the absence of the little heart he was fighting so hard to save. They weren't blackmailers. They were kidnappers. And they had just taken the most precious thing in his life. The emptiness of that hospital bed was an abyss that swallowed all the air in the universe. For a paralyzing second, Arthur's brain refused to accept the image. Reality fractured into a surreal nightmare. The high-pitched beep of the monitor was the scream of a dying hope. The desperate sobs of Elvira, who clung to the doorframe, were the soundtrack to his failure. He, the man who controlled everything, who built and destroyed empires with a signature, had failed to protect one small, fragile child. Guilt hit him with the force of a tidal wave, drowning him in a cold ocean of helplessness. But then, beneath the guilt, something older and fiercer stirred. A white-hot, pure and chilling fury, the paralysis shattered, replaced by a determination as sharp as broken glass. "Elvira, calm down," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, a command in the midst of chaos. "Helen, call hospital security. I want this place locked down. No one in, no one out." He pulled out his cell phone, his fingers moving with mechanical precision, dialing the number of his personal head of security, a former federal agent. "Marcus, code red. The girl has been taken from the hospital. I want your team here in 5 minutes, and I want access to every security camera in the area. I don't care about the cost or the red tape. Get it." As he spoke, the phone in his hand buzzed with a call from a private number. His heart leapt. He answered, putting it on speaker. The same rough, malicious voice from before filled the tense silence. "Missing something. Millionaire." The sneer in the voice was palpable. "Your little investment is with us now, and her rate of return depends on you." "What do you want?" Arthur snarled. "We want a small withdrawal from your vast portfolio. $1 million. In Bitcoin, to leave no trail. You're a businessman. You understand cash flow. Consider it an investment in her health. You have 24 hours, no cops, or your asset will be liquidated. We'll send the crypto wallet details. Don't try to be a hero." The line went dead. $1 million. To him, the sum was manageable. A setback, but not a catastrophe. The problem wasn't the money. It was the choice it represented. At that moment, hospital security and moments later, 2 police detectives entered the room. The older one, a weary man named Detective Miller, took in the scene with eyes that had seen it all. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, his voice neutral. "We got a call about a possible kidnapping." Helen quickly explained the situation, but the detective's eyes were fixed on Arthur. "And what exactly is your relationship to the victim, sir? Our records don't show you as a relative." The question, delivered in a procedural tone, was a veiled accusation. Here was the 4th obstacle, the system turning against him. He wasn't seen as the protective guardian, but as a strange, suspicious piece of the puzzle. "I'm the man who's trying to save her," Arthur answered, his patience wearing thin. "Save her from whom? Why was she with you, a single multi-millionaire man? You understand how this looks to us, don't you, sir?" The insinuations were venomous. They were wasting precious time questioning his motives instead of hunting for the kidnappers. It was Helen who intervened. "Detective, Mr. Caldwell is the best chance this girl has. Her life is at risk every second we waste here." The detective ignored her, his focus still on Arthur. "If you receive a ransom demand, the first thing you will do is inform us. Do not try to do anything on your own. Paying the ransom is the worst mistake you can make." The warning was a direct order, placing him in an impossible position. Trust the police, who clearly suspected him and would move with the speed of bureaucracy, or pay the ransom and risk everything to get Leah back. The clock was ticking, and he had to choose between the law and Leah's life. The hospital room, once a crisis center, had morphed into a stage for suspicion. Detective Miller and his partner looked at Arthur not as a victim, but as an uncontrolled variable. Every question was a probe, trying to find a crack in his story, a hidden motive for the presence of this child in his luxurious life. Arthur, in turn, erected a wall of cold calm. He knew any outburst of anger or despair would be interpreted as guilt. He answered their questions with monosyllabic precision, presenting the image of a cooperative citizen, while inside, his mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour, formulating a parallel plan, dangerous and entirely his own. He would not risk Leah's life on the slowness of a police investigation. The detective's warning not to pay the ransom echoed in his head, not as an order, but as a challenge. While the police set up a makeshift command center in his mansion, monitoring his phone lines and installing equipment, Arthur made a single, discreet call to Marcus, his head of security. "Get the capital ready," he said, his voice low, almost inaudible. "I want 1 million in Bitcoin, ready to transfer at a moment's notice. Traceable to us, invisible to them, and I want your best team to find the location of that call. Use every resource, all of them." It was a declaration of war. He would use his fortune not as a passive ransom, but as a weapon, a lure to draw the predators into his trap. He would feign cooperation with the police, while fighting his own battle in the shadows. As Arthur moved in his world of high-stakes strategy, Helen felt a gnawing unease in her soul. The mention of the Northwood Children's Home, the figure of Mrs. Albright. Something was terribly wrong. The story didn't add up. She stepped away from the bustle in the house and used her personal cell phone to call an old contact at the district attorney's office, a man who owed her a favor from years ago. "Rick, it's me, Helen. I need some off-the-record information. Anything you have on Northwood. Is there an active investigation? Rumors? Anything?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Helen, you're stepping into a hornet's nest," the voice said, low and worried. "Yes, there's an investigation, very quiet, for embezzlement and child endangerment. Mrs. Albright is the primary target. The problem is she has powerful friends, politicians, businessmen, people who fund the home and don't want their names dragged through the mud. They're trying to kill the story. They need everything to look perfect." A chill ran down Helen's spine. "They need witnesses, don't they?" "They do. But the kids there are too young or too scared to talk. And the ones who've left, well, the system loses track of them." In that instant, the truth exploded in Helen's mind with the blinding clarity of a lightning strike. Leah wasn't just a runaway. She was a witness, the only one who had escaped and could expose everything. The kidnapping, it wasn't about money. The ransom was just a distraction, a way to fund the operation and make it look like a common crime. The real goal was far more sinister. It was to silence Leah forever, protecting the dirty secrets of the orphanage and its influential benefactors. She ran back inside the mansion, her heart pounding. She found Arthur in his study, his face illuminated by the blue glow of a computer screen. On the screen was a cryptocurrency wallet, a string of numbers and letters. A new anonymous email was open. It contained the final instructions. The payment was due in 10 minutes. Arthur's finger hovered over the mouse, ready to authorize the transfer that he hoped would buy Leah's life back. "Arthur, don't!" Helen shouted, her voice hoarse with panic as she burst into the room. "Don't pay it. It's a trap." "It's not about the money." Arthur turned, his questioning eyes shifting from tension to confusion. "The kidnapping. Mrs. Albright, from the orphanage. She's behind it all." Helen's accusation hung in the tense air of the study, so shocking and yet so horribly logical that Arthur felt a click in his mind, as if the pieces of an invisible puzzle had just slammed together with violent force. The relentless pursuit, the insistence on getting Leah back, the audacious kidnapping from the hospital. It wasn't about custody or petty revenge. It was about damage control. Leah was a liability, a ticking time bomb that could detonate and destroy the orphanage's charitable facade and the reputations of its powerful patrons. He looked at the computer screen, at the silent countdown the Bitcoin transaction page displayed. 6 minutes remaining. The payment wasn't a ransom. It was the price of Leah's silence. The final payment to make her disappear, and he was certain that once the money was transferred, the inconvenient witness would be eliminated. "Marcus," Arthur said into his earpiece, his voice a cold whisper of pure fury, "did you get a trace?" "We have a signal," the metallic voice on the other end replied. "Faint, but it's moving. A white, unmarked cargo van heading toward the harbor district. They're using a mobile router. That's why the signal is unstable." The harbor district, a labyrinth of shipping containers, abandoned warehouses, and dark alleys, the perfect place to make someone disappear. "Send the coordinates to my car and mobilize the team. No sirens, no fanfare. This is a rescue operation, not an arrest. The primary target is the girl, not the criminals." He stood up, the decision made in a split second. He would not wait for the police, who were still downstairs monitoring a dead phone line. He was going himself. "What are you going to do?" Helen asked, her eyes wide with fear. "You can't go alone." "I'm not going alone," he said, grabbing the keys to the Escalade. "But I can't wait. Their time is running out." He turned to her, his gaze intense. "Helen, you need to do your part. Go to the police. Tell Detective Miller what you know. Hand him Mrs. Albright on a platter. Create as much official noise as you can. It will divide their attention. Create the chaos I need." It was a desperate, risky plan, but it was the only one they had. As Arthur raced to the garage, Helen ran downstairs, her heart in her throat, preparing to face the detective's skepticism and risk her own career to expose the truth. The silver Escalade tore through the night, its powerful engine a restrained roar. On the dashboard, a digital map blinked, showing a red dot moving slowly through the tangle of streets leading to the port. Arthur drove with a fierce concentration, every fiber of his being focused on a single objective. This was no longer about money or business or reputation. It was primal. It was about protecting a life that had become more valuable to him than his entire empire. He reached the harbor district. The place was a cemetery of metal and concrete, eerily silent. He killed his headlights and followed the coordinates to a dilapidated warehouse at the end of an abandoned pier. The white van was parked beside it. He stopped the car at a safe distance, his heart hammering against his ribs. Marcus's team was already moving into position in the shadows, dark figures moving with silent efficiency. Suddenly, the warehouse door slid open, spilling a yellow slash of light into the darkness. One of the kidnappers stepped out. Looking at his phone, it was the signal. The payment hadn't been made. Their time was up. Arthur felt panic rise in his throat. He was about to give the order for his team to move in when a black, expensive-looking sedan sped onto the scene and screeched to a halt beside the van. The back door opened and a woman stepped out. Even at a distance, Arthur recognized her from the photos Helen had shown him. It was Mrs. Albright, the director of the home. She wasn't there to supervise. She was there to finish the job herself. The woman who was supposed to be Leah's protector was, in fact, her executioner. The moment of truth had arrived, an inevitable confrontation in the darkness of the port, with Leah's life hanging by the thinnest of threads. Mrs. Albright's presence on that dark pier confirmed Arthur's worst fears. This was not a ransom negotiation. It was an execution. The time for strategy and subtlety was over. The instant she strode toward the warehouse door, Arthur gave the order into his earpiece. Now, from the dark corners, from behind stacks of containers and the shadows of cranes, Marcus's security team emerged. They moved with the speed and silence of panthers, Before the kidnappers or the orphanage director could react, they were surrounded and subdued. There were no gunshots, only the stunned confusion of the criminals and the outraged shriek of surprise from Mrs. Albright. Arthur leapt from his car and ran into the warehouse. The place reeked of mildew and salt water. In a corner, under the glare of a single hanging bulb, he saw her. Leah was tied to a chair, a gag in her mouth. Her eyes, huge and terrified, widened when she saw him. He ran to her, his heart aching at the sight of her fragility. "It's over, sweetheart. It's over." "I'm here," he whispered, fumbling with the rough knots with trembling fingers. As soon as the gag was off, she let out a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul and threw herself into his arms, shaking uncontrollably. He held her tight, the warmth of her small body against his, the only real thing in this nightmarish world. Sirens began to wail in the distance, rapidly approaching. Helen had done her part. Detective Miller and a dozen police officers swarmed the scene, finding it already under control. Mrs. Albright, the kidnappers, and the so-called foster parents, whom Arthur recognized as the goons the director had hired, were all being handcuffed. The look of shock and fury on Mrs. Albright's face as she saw Arthur holding Leah was the image of defeat. Her castle of lies had crumbled. In the following days, the scandal exploded. The story of the kidnapping attempt linked to the investigation of corruption and endangerment at the Northwood Children's Home dominated the news. Helen's courage in coming forward with the evidence she had, combined with Arthur's resources to expose Mrs. Albright's network of influence, was devastating. Other victims, former employees, and even foster parents who had been blackmailed found the courage to speak up. The system, once an impenetrable foe, began to move in the right direction. Arthur's first victory came quickly. With Mrs. Albright in jail and the home under federal receivership, he was granted temporary custody of Leah without opposition. The cost, however, was high. His family, horrified by the public scandal, made good on their threat. They froze his access to the family trust funds, cutting him off from a significant portion of his fortune. To them, he had chosen a troubled girl over the family name and legacy. Arthur didn't care. He discovered that his own capital, amassed through years of shrewd investment, was more than enough. And for the first time, he felt he was using his wealth for something that truly mattered. Leah's surgery was a success. During her recovery, Arthur never left her side. Helen was a constant visitor. In the long days at the hospital, their friendship deepened, forged in the fire of the crisis and blossoming into a quiet, profound affection. They saw each other not as a millionaire and a social worker, but as two people who had risked everything for a child. The second victory came a few months later. In court, Mrs. Albright and her accomplices were convicted. Justice, slow and imperfect, prevailed. And in the midst of that process, the battle for permanent custody of Leah began. It was an exhausting journey of psychological evaluations, hearings, and mountains of paperwork. But this time, he wasn't alone. Helen was by his side every step of the way, and on a sunny afternoon, a judge finally banged the gavel. The adoption was granted. Leah was officially his daughter. That same day, outside the courthouse, he asked Helen to marry him. The final victory wasn't just about justice or adoption. It was about the creation of something new and beautiful from the ashes of suffering, a family. 6 weeks. Only 42 days had passed since the night of the storm, but it felt as if a lifetime had been lived in the interim. The morning sun streamed into the kitchen. No longer the cold, empty kitchen of a mansion, but of a home warmed by laughter. Leah, sitting at the table, swung her legs that now barely reached the floor, a thin, nearly invisible scar on her chest, the only physical remnant of the battle she had won. She was healthy, rosy-cheeked, and chatty, debating with Arthur about the ideal amount of syrup for her pancakes. Helen watched them, a tender smile on her lips. The severity of her old suits had given way to a light, floral dress, and the social worker who had once come to investigate a suspicious man was now his wife, the mother of the girl who had united their worlds in such unexpected ways. "Are you ready for the big day, sweetie?" Helen asked, tucking a stray piece of hair behind Leah's ear. The girl nodded enthusiastically, her mouth full of pancake. "Yep, today's the day, no more kids get cold in the rain." The simplicity of her statement, delivered with the absolute certainty of a child, was the purest truth. Today was the day. Arthur looked at them, his new family, and felt a wave of gratitude and fullness as overwhelming as the storm on that first night. His old life, a relentless pursuit of more wealth, more profit, more stock, seemed like a distant, faded memory. He realized he had spent years building a fortune of numbers on a screen when the real fortune was right here, sitting at his breakfast table. He hadn't lost part of his inheritance. He had found the only legacy that truly mattered. Later, they arrived at the address. It was an old building that Helen's new foundation, funded by Arthur's capital, had completely renovated. The facade was painted in bright, cheerful colors, and over the door a sign read, "The Beacon House." A small crowd was gathered. Reporters, volunteers, and some of the children who would be the first to call this place home. Parked out front, polished and gleaming in the sun, was the silver Escalade. Arthur had insisted on keeping it, not as a symbol of his old life, but as a memorial. The roof a desperate girl had asked to borrow for one night was now the silent guardian at the door of a real home for many others. Helen gave a short speech, her voice thick with emotion, talking about second chances and the responsibility of everyone to protect the most vulnerable. Then, she called Leah forward. With a pair of round-tipped safety scissors held firmly in her small hands, Leah approached the wide red ribbon stretched across the entrance. Cameras flashed, applause broke out, but she seemed to be in her own world. She looked at the open door of the shelter, at the colorful rooms and neat beds she could see inside. She looked at Arthur and Helen, who were watching her with eyes full of tears and pride. Then, before cutting the ribbon, she leaned into the microphone and whispered, her voice small but clear, carrying the weight of her journey and the lightness of her newfound hope. "Now, no other kids will have to sleep under cars." The snip of the scissors cutting the ribbon was the loudest, most beautiful sound Arthur had ever heard. It was the sound of a circle closing and of a future beginning anew.